Welcome to the start of my journey into the world of fine woodworking. This video will cover the 3-month process of my first real attempt at furniture making with a coffee table made from hard maple. After braving my first trip to the lumberyard, learning what a board foot is, and waiting 2 weeks to let the wood acclimate to my shop, I can finally begin the milling process. I don't have a jointer, so I'm using a shelf board, shims, and hot glue to get a flat reference surface to run through the planer. After hours of doing that for each board, I can finally flip the boards over and run the other side through the planer. I am running the planer on the slowest speed setting so I can always have a board being planed to try and prevent snipe from eating up too much of my material. Unfortunately, this is where I discover that my dust collection setup is not great for using this planer. I didn't learn my lesson and clogged the shop vac again off camera, and it hasn't worked the same since. But I finally finished and have 2 flat and parallel faces on each board. Here I'm using this variable angle tapering jig with the table saw and a track saw to straight line rip one edge of each board. With a flat edge to run up against the table saw fence, I can clean up the other side, and finally the milling process is complete. Here I'm breaking up the boards into more manageable pieces for the panel glue ups. I'm also wishing that I had a bigger miter saw so I didn't have to do this in 2 passes. I was pretty worried about the panel glue up, so I decided to buy this $20 doweling jig off Amazon to try to help keep the boards lined up while I glued them. I spent 20 hours getting to this point, so I was trying to give myself the best chance of success with this first panel glue up. I had seen lots of people using dominoes to help keep the boards aligned during a glue up. The time restriction of working with glue always makes this part more stressful. I'm not sure if I just misaligned the dowels because they don't give you much leeway like a domino or a biscuit would, or if they were just a really tight fit, but I had a lot of trouble getting the boards to come together. So first I tried to just use the clamps to just squeeze them together more, but that wasn't really working. So I undid the clamps and then hammered it some more, and you can see I finally closed the gaps up a bit better. That just got it close though, and there's still some small gaps that I'm trying to close up with the clamps. I thought the glue squeeze out looked pretty good, so I thought I was all set. It's pretty annoying to remove the glue squeeze out after it dries, because it adheres to the wood so well that when you try to remove it, sometimes you end up removing chunks of the wood as well. So here I'm just trying to clean it all up before it dries and get it in a good place where I can just sand down what's left. Then I noticed another gap, so I quickly grabbed another clamp and cranked it down as hard as I could to try to close it up. But it didn't work, and I still had this pretty big gap that I could easily slide a piece of printer paper through. It was just way too big a gap to live with, so I took it back to the table saw and ripped it back into individual boards to try jointing it again. During this process, I realized that the cuts I was getting with the table saw just weren't straight enough to get a good joint in a panel glue up. I went back and did some research on how to get a good joint between 2 boards and found this trick using a hand plane with the 2 edges you want glued clamped together. Because you're planing both boards at the same time, you don't need the edges to be a perfect 90 degrees to the face. The angles will be complementary, so you'll still get a flat panel. I was pretty happy with the seams I got using the hand plane trick, and I didn't want to go back to using my cheap doweling jig, so I decided to make these clamping calls to try to keep each board parallel and flat to the next. This time I waited 20 or 30 minutes to let the glue set up a little bit before cleaning out the squeeze out. It leaves a bit less of a mess, so you have a little less to clean up when sanding the panel later on. I didn't want to attempt to glue up another panel until I saw how this one turned out, so the shop supervisor and I went out and enjoyed the fall foliage while we waited. The first panel turned out much better, so I went ahead and glued up the other 4. Unfortunately, they didn't turn out quite flat enough, so then I had to spend hours and hours sanding and hand planing trying to get them as flat as I could by hand. This is just part of the time I spent on one panel, and this is played back 100 times faster than normal speed, so you can imagine how fun this process was. Finally, with the panels as flat as I could make them, I took them back over to the table saw to try to clean up one edge. I didn't need the accuracy of a jointed edge for a panel glue up, so the table saw ended up working out okay for this part. I then used these straight flat edges to reference up against the fence of the sled to clean up the other edge before I started cutting the miters. And now onto the scary part where I start trying to cut the miters. Now I just have to repeat this process twice for each of the 4 pieces. And now it's time for the moment of truth, where I test the fit to see how it looks. I was pretty worried about this because I know my table saw is not very accurate, and trying to get a perfect miter joint across this 18-inch long piece seemed scary. But it actually turned out pretty good. Now that I knew the miters were actually going to come out okay, I could make the second cut on each piece, which would determine the final length. And these had to remain consistent between the opposite piece, so I used the stop block on the sled to make sure that both pieces would come out to be the same length. I took out a few clamps and did a dry fit of the box part of the coffee table to see how it all came out, and then I took a second to admire my handiwork. I was getting pretty excited at this point in the project. I think the long miter joints look pretty cool, but unfortunately they're not very strong. I didn't trust the end grain to end grain glue connection, and I didn't want this to be a weak point in the table, so I decided to use hidden splines to reinforce the joints. The best way I could think of to make the hidden grooves that the splines would sit in with the tools I had at the time was to make this jig at a 45-degree angle that I could use my handheld palm router and a plunge base and just in many stages route out a groove for the splines to sit in. I'm sure I didn't come up with this idea on my own, but I was pretty happy that I thought of doing this. Unfortunately, this wasn't a very fast method, as you can already see. This is obviously sped up footage, and it's taking me a while to just put the jig together. And spoiler alert, it takes significantly longer to route out the grooves in each of the pieces because I have to do it 8 times. And my router is pretty underpowered for this task. I think it took probably 7 or 8 passes for each of the 8 pieces I had to route a groove in. Once I had the jig set up, I tried it on a test piece first before I ruined any of my main pieces. The edge guide of the router just runs along the top of the jig, so I'm routing a groove in the same spot on every piece. I was pretty happy with the results of this test piece though. Here you can see how the spline works. I glue the long skinny piece in between each of the 2 pieces, and because the angle is shallower, it's more of a long grain to long grain connection, resulting in a much stronger joint. Now that I know that the jig works, it's on to the real project pieces. Because I had to route out 8 grooves, and I had to do it in multiple passes each, I probably did this about 50 times, and you can see even with it sped up that it takes quite a while for the router to pass through. I saved the jig, but I'm not sure I'm going to want to take the time to do this ever again. With all the grooves done, I could cut out the splines on the bandsaw. Finally, the box section of the table is complete. It was very satisfying to stack all these pieces, knowing that I was done and it was ready to be glued up. Before I do any gluing there though, I had to start laying out the leg pieces. I went through my less desirable offcuts and carefully took my time planning out where each piece would go so I could maximize the material. I think I underestimated how much wood I would need for this project, so I really took my time and made sure I didn't waste anything here. With the pieces all marked out, I could begin cutting them down. If I had to make more legs, I would probably make a template for this, but I ultimately only needed 2 pieces in each size, so I thought it was best to not go with a template. This table saw sled works really great as a tapering jig to make consistent cuts. First, I just cut the pieces down to the correct length, and then after I changed the setup so I could cut the long taper for each leg. The legs were pretty narrow, so I had to get a little creative with the clamping here. Once again, the stop block is invaluable to make sure the cuts are consistent between each of the leg pairs. Now that the main leg pieces were done, I put together this little jig so I could mark out the joinery for the cross pieces. I really didn't want any of the pieces to move while I was marking things out, so I put a clamp on all four corners here. I wanted to challenge myself by making bridle joints for this because I knew they're super strong and I think they look pretty cool. I really took my time with laying out the joinery though. As much as I love working with hand tools, I don't have unlimited time, so I try to make use of power tools where possible to do the bulk material removal, and then I can come in with hand tools after to do the finessing. These joints are at roughly a 10-degree angle though, so I couldn't go all the way with the bandsaw, so I had to finish up with the handsaw. So I just set up all the legs in a row, and I went sawing away. I did only clear up the middle waist on one of the legs with the bandsaw though. I figured it wouldn't be too bad to use the coping saw here to cut out the middle, and boy was I wrong. I'm sure there's definitely some user error here, but man, this really takes a long time. It was all worth it for this part though. So satisfying. Cleaning up these joints with the chisel was not a very quick process either though. I could definitely use some more practice here in speeding things up and coming up with a nicer result at the end. This shot is playing back at 20 times speed. This is how painful it is to use the coping saw to clean out these pieces. But worth it in the end. I wasn't too worried with how the inside of the joint would look, but I did want the outside edges to look good. So here I'm establishing a straight line across the joint. This next part was a little nerve-wracking. It's always kind of scary to be chiseling down into end grain because you don't have a ton of control over where the chisel will go. The chisel just kind of follows which way the grain goes. Now with the line established, I can pare away the excess. And on to the next piece. Always satisfying. I quickly tested the fit, and it was a little too snug and I couldn't get the joint together. So I took out the router plane and started trying to clean up the middle connecting piece. I was struggling to get the router plane to cut well though, so I figured it was time to resharpen the blade. I've had pretty good success getting blades sharp with this scary sharp sandpaper system, but sharpening is still one of my least favorite activities. I was also struggling to get a good reference surface with the router plane, so I made this wider base with a piece of plywood. With the first joint dry assembled, it was time to do a quick strength test. Probably my favorite design detail of the whole piece is these angled tapered bevels. The track saw really is the best tool to do this. As you can see, it struggled a bit more with the crosscut section, so there's going to be a lot of sanding to take out those burn marks. Here I'm drilling the holes where the bolts that attach the legs to the base of the coffee table will sit. I used a Forstner bit to recess a wider hole for the bolt head to sit. And then off camera, I made these clamping blocks to help with the glue up. This glue up actually went pretty smoothly. The clamping blocks made a huge difference, and there were no really stressful situations, luckily. Right here, I'm adding a sawdust and glue mixture to all the seams of the joint to help hide any gaps. With both leg assemblies glued up, it was time to just let it set up overnight and come back the next day. The shop supervisor came down to help inspect the glue up results. I purposely left the centerpiece of the bridle joint long so I could trim it flush with this Japanese pole saw after it was all glued up. And then after it was trimmed, I could flush it up with a hand plane. For those keen-eyed among you, you'll notice that this is a different hand plane from what I was using before. I stumbled across the Veritas factory default sale, and I couldn't pass this one up. I really only ever want this to be a fun hobby for me, and using nice tools like this really just makes it a lot more enjoyable. Here I'm just flushing up the joint on the top, and then I'm going to make sure that it's square so the legs won't sit out at a weird angle. The first project I made when I started woodworking was this rolling workbench. And I think like most people, their first workbench is definitely not their best workbench. And the work holding options here left a bit to be desired, so I had to get a little creative to keep these legs in place. I spent a few months building this table, and a few months went by before I even started working on this video. So watching this back is a little bit painful. I spent so much time trying to line up the holes for the threaded inserts to bolt the legs to the table, and spoiler alert, it did not go well. First, I really struggled to get the inserts seated all the way into the table. Once I finally got them flush, I had a lot of trouble bolting the leg on because they didn't really line up properly. And there's also one more issue that I'm finding here with the square. This next shot shows just how far off the threaded inserts were from square. This other one I also couldn't get to sit flush, so I had to resort to some more barbaric methods to remove it. I was probably 2 months into the project at this point, and honestly I was getting a little frustrated at my slow progress. So I decided to splurge on my most expensive tool yet, the ever-divisive Festool domino. There was a lot of debate over the worth of the domino, but one thing I don't see brought up often is the main selling point for me, its size. It's all well and good that I can create strong, invisible joinery quickly, accurately, and cleanly, but the compact size is huge for me in a small workshop. I also really miss having a coffee table at this point, and I really wanted to get this project wrapped up. The 3 mortises I'm plunging here in the leg assembly are with the tight setting. And then on the table, I'm going to use the tight setting in the middle and the middle wide setting on the 2 outer sides to hopefully account for any wood movement. With the mortises plunged, I could then do a quick dry fit and double check for square, and luckily this time it was square. The one part of the design I was pretty worried about was the strength of the joint between the flat table section and the box section of the coffee table. I could do another like hidden spline joint with a complex router jig, but the domino really came in perfect here. I knew it was going to be basically impossible to sand the inside of the box once it was assembled, so I did a quick sanding up to 120 grit before assembling the box. Then I taped up the edges of all the joints to try to catch any of the glue squeeze out because I knew I wouldn't be able to get it after it was glued up. While the leg assembly glue up went surprisingly well and was not very stressful, this glue up was the complete opposite. This was a nightmare. I think where I went wrong here is I didn't account for how much the wood would swell up once the glue was applied, so the splines fit too tightly and I really struggled to close up the joints. So you can see me pounding away here with the hammer without too much luck. I got it as close as I could, and then I figured I could just clamp it tighter and the clamps would solve the problem, which unfortunately did not turn out to be the case. I'm in full panic mode here, so I took it apart and now I'm trying to sand down the splines to get a looser fit, and I'm hoping that this will be good enough where I can close the seams in the box. I was also very optimistic to try to use these picture frame clamps. They just do not have the clamping pressure needed to pull this joint together. Not even the parallel clamps I'm using had enough strength. The camera died during this part, but here you can see all the clamps I own trying to squeeze this joint together. At least I got to have a little bit of fun peeling the drag glue off all the silicone. Trying to salvage these joints and fix the massive gaps ended up being a lot of work. The first part of the cleanup process was flushing up the sides of all the joints, and the best way I figured to do this was to use a hand plane. Unfortunately, you can see it rocking back and forth because I don't really have a great way to secure this. I do really love that new hand plane though. I clamped these support blocks onto the sides of the box to use as a reference to route the inside bevel again with the joints all flushed up. The router bit can't get all the way into the corners though, so this part I had to come in and fix with the chisel. I definitely got a lot of hand tool practice working on this project. After a lot more cleanup work off camera, it was finally time for the final glue up. My work surface here is not very big, so I had to get a little creative with how this was going to work. I glued the dominoes into one side of the joint first, and then added glue to the second side after to try to avoid any issues with the glue drying and setting up before I was fully done. I glued the leg assemblies onto each side of the coffee table first, and then after I joined the two sides together. I was definitely still pretty stressed at this point in the project, but the finish line was clearly in sight and I was getting pretty excited. I got rid of my IKEA coffee table before I started this project and figured it might take me a few weeks, maybe a month tops. And here I am, probably 3 months later, finally putting the finishing touches on my coffee table. I was also trying to be pretty careful here not to get too much glue squeeze out anywhere because I had done a bit of sanding beforehand, so I didn't want to need to clean up too much glue squeeze out. As you can see with the pencil lines on the top of the table there, I wasn't fully done sanding, but I had started with the lower grits already. Now with the table mostly assembled, trying to maneuver it myself on the workbench was starting to get kind of difficult. I did manage to get it into this spot though, where with it dangling over either end, and I could add the clamps to fully close up this joint here. I also added 2 clamps on either end to make sure the legs stayed where they needed to be. At this point, I also noticed that the table was sagging a little bit. Probably the weight of the clamps didn't help much. So I broke out these other clamps and then tightened them a bit to try to make sure I was getting a square edge here. It might be a little hard to tell in this shot, but those clamps were bending quite a bit. This video is already a lot longer than I ever thought it would be, so I'll spare you all of the boring sanding shots, and here's a look at the fully assembled and sanded table. Because I learned basically everything I know about woodworking here on YouTube, the finish I'm using is Rubio Monocoat, And before I break out the Rubio, I have to clean it up with mineral spirits. I chose Rubio for this project because I didn't have a lot of confidence in my finishing ability, and everything I've seen makes it seem like it's pretty foolproof. You just mix the two parts together and then wipe the finish on and then buff it off. This buffing pad on the orbital sander did a great job buffing off the excess finish. Then I just followed it up with a blue shop towel to get all the remaining finish on the surface. And with that, I have a coffee table again.